Classical thought, as it is represented now, as having a principle base which goes on punching holes into philosophy as it has been repackaged is roundly, fine and even rings correct, so long as the classical philosophy is concentrated first into principles. And it is the adherence to a principle thought that is the ideal and more analogous to the sameness of arithmetic. The history of function and theory as is not greeted by your claim that it has always been rudimentary. But much of philosophy has been reduced to our treatment of linguistics. The classical paradigms did not examine nor treat the medium of their expressions as a dissection of the grammar used among people, not to mention the history of etymologic thought, at the dawn of man, not yet possible to look back upon itself. It would not have been reasonable nor possible for a dissection, nor description of the components of our medium of communication, as this idea, this direction towards which humanity had not yet peered, and was it an orderly penalized one describing, was also the birth of synchronic thought, that is to say propositions which held synchronicity with one another. But not diachronic use of language had not nor could not have been born of humanity as of yet, as an infant cannot give birth to another infant. Diachronies, the canalizing changes over time, could not have rationally occurred until language was seasoned enough to look back at itself. The Principate, whose expression dictated the first vivisection of language via expressions where once lingual expressions were not, and whence humanity changed drastically from what it once was, or how it once behaved into language-speaking creatures. A scribe lays down a text, and the reader picks it up with a description, a describing. For clarity's sake, humans prior to, and moving towards humanity, as a fact, a proposition was laid. This proposition was the base of many propositions which make up the principles expressions of how humanity sees its world. The first carvers which presented pictographs became the first scribes of human expressions. The first descriptions, describings, of human expressions represented the first possibility of verification that humans were able to understand one another via the means of symbols. Since there was a first principate, principal expressor, scribe, author, the representation of that author's symbol constitutes plagiarism. This connotes the first power structure via an authority, the first present scribe, the first present describer, the first petitioner of that authority, and the first repetition of that authority. Equal is subject to the monarch of repetition. That first principate which forces the repetition of a symbol. Up to speed is more than an idealistic expression. Certainly, a culmination of thought occurred to reach a peak from which classicism had its beginning, end and legacy for you to have a base of principles from which to draw, or for clarity's sake, a base from which to pull the phrase, up to speed, from. By this I mean in summary, a principal expression of a human or human group which created principles of thinking, which in turn became the basis of what is to be called real, or the case, or classic, and hence classical. In the tradition of classicism we receive rationality, formalism and eventually logic. But this cannot continue without noting that the formalization of logic did not occur during the age of classicism. The formalities of logic came about after, and as a consequence of rationality found within our language. The history of classicism coming to its end was a precursor to the formalization of rationality into logic, propositional logic, truth table, truth function, as well as propositional calculus and its attributes. Language which is capable of looking back upon itself, language which has diachronic capability, differs from language which did not have that capability. So there exists a beginning of language, a beginning of words, graphics, scribings, as well as a beginning of synchronicity and the beginning of diachronic. The fact that our language changes and much is added and much is lost or not used from the etymologic history is not a statement which a prior negates the foundation of our language as coming from the scribe's inscription being described and rescribed about a particular subject, distinct from other subjects found within the symbols, graphics and syntax, pointed to, gestured towards, insisted upon, agreed upon, scribed about, described about. Therefore it is my contention that the material existed from which the scribes carves from, and that this material world is the basis of inspiration for much of what is referenced by the scribing itself. But this material existence does not preclude the disconnect between the representation of an item in the material world, in pictograph being represented into symbols of pictographs, graphemes, and those graphemes being re-represented into symbols, and the fact of material basis from which the act of scribing can be described does not challenge the psychological, psycholinguist independence which a series of syntax, text can speak about itself from. This is to say that the language used for all defenses of a grounded material world, from which language has sprouted, are all found within, and only within the ontological descriptions found within modern deconstruction practices. For the structure of our syntactic use is looking back upon itself, which looks back upon syntax looking back upon glyphs, also known as hieroglyphs or pictorial glyphs, and pictorial glyphs looking upon and presenting that which is both not material, not what we now call real, so something which is not representational of the real world, the grounded world, the world we are confident precluded the language itself, but the glyphs also represent things we would call real, representable and diachronic to principles of classicism. The conglomeration of syntax as it tends to define structures of language, schools or trends of syntax, and structures of syntax overshadowing the ordering of syntax, and the first ordering of syntax overshadowing the first rationing of syntax, and the first rationing of syntax overshadowing, representing the glyphs, the graphic history of language, and the graphics, also known as graphemes, of the history of our language, overshadowing the oral sounds expressed from throughout our ancestors. All of our current formalism and its current describing power is transcended with full confidence that our forebears lived and thought and acted, performed and behaved in the same manner as we currently do, is the grounding of the modern objectivist stance and the speculation of the philosophers and linguists. The psychology of the objectivist, which precludes that all current considerations of what is real, the case, factual, evident, as well as the rationality is incarnate in individuals now as it was at the dawn of man, is a matter of rhetorical faith, as well as human awareness. The modern grammarian may speculate, make reflections and considerations about the progression of language, and find themselves unfoolishly foolish when adhering themselves and the history of public language users strictly to perspectivism, associations and relations, relativism. But they do this at the peril of losing the ground, the wall, the object from which the first scribes scribed upon. In summary again, objectivists want everyone to recognize the world as we know it and know it now, that is to say, as we intuit it as a matter of fact, while grammarians want to point out that calculus was not formed by cave dwellers and that the extent of our logic and our language's ability to appear back upon itself affronts the first precipitate, first principle, that of identity distinction from the prelingual beast who could not utter the word I, but who could scrape rock and pillow. Throughout lingual histories to the current extenuation of logical and dislogical imagination, speculative thought, not to mention the reasonable and rational pathological processes made available via consideration text and text tracking, calculus, formal logic, of postmodernism and consideration of language evolution in general and more specifically, objectivists want grammarians to obey to the authorial principles of not chasing one's own coattails, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, although the grammarian notes that our imagination is a part of our grammar,